Good morning. I'm Jared Ball, Chief Economist at the Committee for Economic Development of Australia. CEDA is a leading independent think tank committed to shaping long-term prosperity for all Australians. Through independent research and frank debate, we influence policy and collaborate to disrupt for good. And today, we're turning our attention to the state of global supply chains. Has the COVID pandemic heralded a new era of regularly disrupted supply chains? Before we start, though, I would like to respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which I come to you from today, the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and acknowledge their elders past, present, and emerging. You can join today's conversation by following CEDA on Twitter at CEDA_news, and today we're using the hashtag #ShocksVShifts. You can also participate in the discussion on our online Q&A portal called Pigeonhole. That's available via the link below your screen. You can also go to ceda.pigeonhole.at and enter the passcode supply chain to access that. And as I always say, please get into that Q&A portal early, put your questions in, and also vote on the questions of others, because we will, as soon as we have a critical mass of those questions, we will be coming to them. So get your questions in on the global supply chain issues as we begin the conversation. At the beginning of the pandemic, I think most people saw supply chain disruption as a one-off, unusual episode. The lockdown of the global trade hub of Wuhan in China, the decimation of air freight capacity, and changing patterns of consumption that we saw from services to goods during lockdowns. But that disruption has proved far more persistent, a little bit like inflationary pressures at the present time. We've seen just how intricate, complex, and in many cases, just how concentrated our global supply chains are. And of course, the range of knock-on impacts and other external shocks that can compound disruption and bottlenecks across the system. So today is about unpacking the global and domestic dimensions of this and beginning to understand how the shocks will actually drive long-term shifts. And we've got a really excellent panel to discuss these issues today. Tanya Barden, OAM, who is the CEO of the Australian Food and Grocery Council. We've got Matthew Pepper, who's an associate professor at the University of Wollongong, and Damien Bruckard, who's the head of global engagement at the International Chamber of Commerce. So we're going to get straight into the conversation. And Damien Bruckard, I want to start with you in terms of, we've obviously seen, both a long and a short evolution of this, it feels like, in terms of just the number of different factors impacting on global trade and supply chains from the pandemic through to the more recent sort of developments around the war in Ukraine. Can you just paint a little bit of a picture for us of just how that situation has evolved and what you see as some of the key sort of drivers of the supply chain shocks that we've seen?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Jared, and thank you to CEDA for having me here today. So really the situation has been quite extraordinary over the last 2 years, where supply chains have faced sort of more powerful and frequent risks. Right now, we've obviously seen soaring freight costs. So just to give you a sort of snapshot of this, spot rates for container freight have risen around sixfold in the last 2 years. We've had transport congestion and delays. So, in 2020, for instance, around 2/3 of ships arrived on time. Now 2/3 are late. Turnaround time for ships at ports have doubled. And then we've obviously had difficulties accessing critical inputs as well. So semiconductors are a key item here, where demand for chips has soared since the start of the pandemic, as people shifted to remote working, online shopping went up, and other contactless activities increased. And then, the ubiquity of chips meant that machinery production has been impacted. And this is why you're now looking at having a 9-month wait in buying a new car in Australia, for example. Then at the same time, we had many countries actually losing direct connections as operators reconfigured their networks. So in Latin America, Europe, and Sub-Saharan Africa, these were hit especially hard, with connections really being lost. when you talk about the key drivers here, Jared, I mean, I think there are a few on the sort of supply side and demand side drivers. So at the start of the pandemic, you really had this surging demand for physical goods, as you mentioned, and so basically the transport providers' infrastructure struggled to keep up with this. Then, as economies reopened and lockdown measures eased, demands for goods and commodities sort of rebounded, and this created additional tensions on supply chains, especially in vehicles, furniture, and clothing. Then on the supply side, you had all of these operational disruptions. You mentioned China. Lockdowns led to differentiated port closures, disrupted shipping, weak port infrastructure, especially in the United States, lack of trucking capacity, shortage of skilled workers. This all exacerbated the problem. And then you also had companies trying to adapt to these situations, moving from what was known as just-in-time strategies to just-in-case strategies, seeking to build inventory buffers, and this actually increased pressure as well. And then, of course, 2022 rolls around, we think we're out of the pandemic, and then Russia illegally invades Ukraine. And so this has worsened supply chain disruptions and the inflation trends that you mentioned as well. So on the supply chain side, obviously, the invasion has directly led to sea, land, and air transport routes and infrastructure being disabled in Ukraine and the Black Sea. And this has led to some pretty significant changes in supply chains. So supplier lead times since the start of the war have lengthened by about 15%. Input prices have risen to record levels and are now 25% higher than they were before the war. And more problematic, I think, here is how it's affected food supply chains. So need to recall here that Russia and Ukraine and Belarus are huge suppliers of wheat and fertilizers, sunflower oil, but also energy supplies. And so with them being cut off from global markets owing to both the war and sanctions, especially on fertilizers, we've seen the prices of these goods go up enormously. And this is really leading to a sort of perfect storm. And the world is entering a cost of living crisis. So food is more expensive than it has ever been. Fertilizers have gone up 155%. Wheat's gone up 32%. Maize 26%. Shipping costs are now 3 times higher than their pre-COVID average. Crude oil is at record levels. Gas prices in Europe, where I live, but not today, are now 10% higher than they were 2 years ago. And so this is all sort of mutually reinforcing trends here. So as the cost of energy goes up, shipping costs goes up, food prices go up, and it's all a vicious cycle. And this is really scary at the global level. Obviously, in Australia, cost of living is a major factor in the election tomorrow, and something that people are feeling really deeply. But in the developing world, it's much, much more acute. So the UN now predicts that 47 million more people will go hungry this year. There's a real risk of famine, especially in Africa and the Middle East. And there's many countries in the world, I think around 108, who are exposed to potential default on their public debt. First of which is probably going to be Russia, whose public debt could well go into debt in the next couple of weeks. So really, we're looking at a very difficult global situation. Supply chains are a huge part of this, but they're also being affected by these broader problems with inflation and a sort of looming financial crisis.
Thanks, Damien. You've painted a set of really compounding and evolving factors here that are quite significant on the global stage, and obviously right into the food sector. And Tanya, obviously, you and your members are at the front line of how some of these issues have been playing out in food and grocery. obviously there's the global factors that Damien's talked about, but of course we've had some domestic things that have gone on as well in terms of natural disasters and other factors. So how have you seen this play out so far in food and grocery?
Look, it's been absolutely extraordinary what's happened in the last couple of years, but I am amazed really at the resilience of the industry to get through it. So I do at the outset just want to say that, Australia is a very food secure nation, and we don't have a problem in actually getting enough food produced. But it is a lot of these, sort of short-term temporary logistical challenges in being able to get things around. But I do share Damien's concerns about the global outlook very much. So right at the beginning of the pandemic, we saw this massive surge in consumer buying as a result of government lockdowns, which meant that people started hoarding. And that behaviour shift is something that the food and grocery industry isn't prepared for. Normally, businesses hold about up to a week or 2 weeks of finished goods, and the production systems just keep flowing. When you have that massive surge in demand that's unpredicted, the supply chain is just not able to catch up quickly. And that was why at the beginning we saw quite a lot of shortages in those early weeks of lockdowns. We then saw globally, as Damien talked about, those shifts around shipping. And we have to remember that domestically we do rely on quite a few inputs of ingredients that are imported into Australia. And that did start to have a compounding effect. We also, I think, in Australia have been uniquely affected by some flooding events through all of this as well. So the Central Australia, the East Coast flooding caused massive disruption. Most of Australia's food production occurs on the East Coast. So Western Australia, from flooding that occurred back earlier this year, is still not back at full capacity of operating for food and groceries. So, there's just been delays in getting transport, whether it's rail or road, across to WA. Globally, some of the weather events have also impacted on ingredients into the supply chains, because while we've had flooding, other nations have had some severe drought. And so there's been a global shortage of some commodities as well. And then more recently, as Damien talked about, that impact of the Russian invasion of Ukraine has impacted on global commodity availability and, things like oil. People think about the impact of that on fuel, but it also is a major input into packaging. And if you don't have the packaging, you can't see. And so that's been a big issue recent about these issues, is really, combination of weather, COVID, global supply chain disruption, and behind the scenes, there's been an enormous amount of work that has gone on to try and keep products flowing through to consumers. We've been meeting regularly throughout the pandemic between supermarket retailers, manufacturing bodies, and governments. And there's been some shifts that have been made to help make sure that supplies can keep going as best they can. But there's an enormous amount of work and pressure behind the scenes to get it there.
Thanks, Tanya. And I guess want to come to you, Matt, a little bit on that behind the scenes and what's happening with business. Just how are you seeing business think about the risk in supply chains now, and how are they beginning to respond in terms of some of those common practices that we've seen historically around just in time and other sort of approaches, and how are they adapting, do you think?
Okay, thanks, Jared. I think it's important to just reflect on the number of different disruptions and go back to the words of Damien and Tanya. If we look back to just before the pandemic, we had in Australia the bushfires, then we've had the global pandemic, the flooding, the war in the Ukraine, and of course, ongoing adverse weather elsewhere. And each of these disruptions had a different impact, or has an ongoing impact in different ways. For example, the pandemic clearly had a big or a large impact on people able to present at work and take part in some of these essential supply chain functions. For example, the logistics function and in the global ports and local ports impacted how they could actually operate. Whereas something like the floods and the bushfires, they clearly impact local infrastructure. And so we need to think through ways of overcoming and being adaptable to these changes in shortest time as possible. So I guess in terms of businesses, they've got some difficult decisions to make, and the first of which is really how to integrate risk planning in their supply chain strategy, because the risks of the disruptions have been so different, and so while recovering and adapting to the ripple effects and maybe adapting well to traceability and transparency needs to overcome from a bushfire or the pandemic, then of course something else happens and has a vastly different impact and has a multiplier effect to the state of each supply chain. And so again, drawing upon comments from Damien and Tanya, the school of thought that in the last couple of decades, businesses have really, I guess, erred towards becoming too lean, too just in time in their thinking, which perhaps creates a more fragile system. And of course, when there's a peak or a spike in demand or a rapid change, then this is difficult to accommodate, and we really see the system under stress, which has led to a move towards becoming more responsive over perhaps a traditional focus, if you like, on cost efficiencies. And if we think about the disruptions or in terms of, or the supply chain risk profile in terms of VUCA, so an acronym I'm sure you know, so volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. Businesses are faced with those four things at every stage of their supply chain. And so as consumer demand rapidly changes, I think we mentioned panic buying or working from home, which would clearly impact things like microprocessors and chips and plastics and what have you, as the demand for consumer electronics spikes. We also have a supply side bottleneck, which will of course lead to an increase in price or cost for these businesses. And I guess the real question for businesses is, at what point do they begin to pass that cost over to the consumer? I think that's a critical part there. So how just in case do they become? How do they reorganize and perhaps connect with local or regional communities of businesses and consumers? And how do they manage the ongoing cost rises?
Thanks, Matt. Tanya, did you want to pick up on that point that Matt's just made there around, the passing on of cost and just the pressure that's being faced by business at the moment, and around those issues? Obviously, there's a premium on certainty of supply and delivery, but how do companies approach this challenge around continuing to deliver for consumers and trading off those sort of price rises that are likely, both as we're seeing now, but also in the future to come?
Yeah, look, I might just give a really practical example. If you think about a bottle of milk or a loaf of bread, everything to do with making and distributing that has gone up in price. So the fresh ingredients, whether it's the grains, the oils, the milk, on-farm costs have gone up significantly, with massive increases in fertilizer, because a lot of the urea comes out of other countries that are facing massive disruption. So there's that on-farm cost, and labour availability has been really impacted in Australia, particularly in the agriculture sector, because of restrictions around migration during the pandemic period. So on-farm costs gone up, into manufacturing, labour availability through the pandemic, shortages of particular ingredients or packaging, massive cost increases around disruption for transport domestically and internationally. They've all flowed through, the big packaging cost increases as well. And then even things as simple as being able to put your product onto a pallet to move it along the distribution chain and to get it into a retail store. So massive costs across all elements of this. And I think a really important context is that over the last decade, food and grocery manufacturers have been really constrained in their ability to be able to pass through costs because of the retail concentration we have in Australia. And that has meant that there's been a fall from $8 billion to $5 billion in food and grocery manufacturing profitability. And now with the cost increases coming through, businesses aren't at a point where they can continue to absorb those. They really are at a tipping point where they need to pass some of these through in order to remain viable. And so in the March figures from the ABS, we saw that CPI for grocery food items had gone up 5.3%. And I think we can expect that to be hitting double digit by mid-year. And from a consumer perspective, this is absolutely challenging. From an industry perspective, that is still only representing a small proportion of the costs that have come through. So, there is still a lot of work industry is doing to try and be as efficient and productive as the industry can and to absorb where they can, but needing to pass through in order to maintain viability and maintain jobs in Australia. I think a really important point is that the industry is trying to strike that balance. And there is a lot of discussion going on about how do you make sure that vulnerable consumers are protected, working with groups like Food Bank to make sure that they're well supported to be able to help vulnerable communities. And then there's also, I think, for shoppers, decisions that we're seeing being made overseas where consumers are in some instances trading down to a lower value rather than a premium product. There is a lot of choice. We have a huge diversity in suppliers of food and groceries, different brands. Supermarkets have their own brands. There's bulk suppliers and so on. So consumers just will need to shop around more and, be conscious around what specials are available, whether they want to buy premium or value products. Because I think, as I say, this is, going to get worse before it does get better.
Thanks, Tanya. Some sobering sort of thoughts there and around what is likely to come. Can I just remind people, jump on Pigeonhole and put in your questions. We do have a few coming in, but I'd like to see some more. Would be excellent. So in terms of, Tanya's just mentioned, Damien, diversity of suppliers in food and grocery, but this was a bigger question particularly early on in the pandemic around diversification of supply. And perhaps a lot of people looked initially to the idea of onshoring around how you would diversify supply and manage risk. I think in the most recent IMF update, they've pointed to the fact that actually a great majority of companies get their intermediate goods from domestic suppliers, and that in itself represents a little bit of a risk. How do you see at the ICC this issue around how to promote that kind of broadening of trade relationships to diversify supply, as opposed to, I guess, this kind of view around onshoring as well? How do you balance those two things and the position that countries should take?
Yeah, absolutely. I might come back to that after just bouncing off one thing that Tanya said just then about the food price increases, because this is absolutely true in Australia. And then it's going to be a real problem for Australia as well, I think, as a sort of foreign policy matter as well, because of how severe the consequences will be in much of the developing world. So talking about the sort of shifts in consumer behavior that will be required as a result of food price increases. In the developing world, for instance, 55% of costs of smallholder farmers are from fertilizers. They're not going to be able to absorb those increased costs in fertilizer prices. They're basically going to go out of business and stop producing food. In Brazil, which is a huge food exporter, all of their fertilizer comes from Russia and they can't get it. So in the next 2-3 years, there's going to be massively lower crop yields. And when we start to think through what that means, a lack of food in the developing world, thinking back to, say, the Arab Spring, we're looking at the potential for political, social instability. So I just wanted to put that on the table as well. And that will bounce back to the advanced economies. But in terms of this sort of diversification question, I mean, really our view here is that these sort of impulses towards reshoring, nearshoring, friendshoring, you know, whatever the slogan of the day is, are really quite misguided, because I think if we've learned anything from this pandemic, it's that supply chains are really complicated. They're very complex. The average car, for instance, requires around 30,000 parts. You know, and each of those individual widgets often sort of cross multiple borders and continents. And as soon as governments try to start to get into the business of regulating those supply chains or bringing them home, it doesn't work. It's just too complex. And so really what is required of governments is keeping, you know, broadly open trade settings, you know, promoting trade liberalization as much as possible, sort of bolstering the role of the World Trade Organization, other international organizations, sort of encouraging their economies domestically to become more productive. So the productivity agenda is really important here. Keeping you know, investment settings open as well, minimal restrictions on trade. You know, this is the way to go, because you know, those alternative approaches that we saw during COVID, you know, export bans on PPE, on vaccine production, this was disastrous. It just didn't work. And it can cost lives. So, you know, there's an extreme example, but it applies pretty much across the board to all services. So really, we see, you know, a case for governments to double down on the open trade agenda, sort of boost the role of the WTO, which is in, you know, pretty dire straits at the moment, and have as much international cooperation as possible, including through through sort of more innovative approaches to getting global transparency over supply chains, which have, you know, hitherto been pretty opaque.
Thanks for that, Damien. I might come to you, Tanya, on that. We might just stick with this kind of issue of diversification for a little while, and we do have some questions piling up, so I will absolutely come to them. I don't want them to be like our bottlenecks in our supply chains and have a lot of questions building up. But Tanya, how are you seeing this particular issue playing out in your sector in terms of managing a diversity of suppliers and some of the risks that are in particular geographies at the moment?
Yeah, so I mentioned that there are a lot of suppliers of food and grocery products, but as you move further back into the supply chain, some of the intermediate input providers are a lot more concentrated in the supply chain. So, for example, food manufacturing relies heavily on imports from China of a number of ingredients that are really critical. So certain enzymes and vitamins that really are essential for food production. And within food production, you've also got some limitations around how quickly you can actually substitute, because we have regulated information on pack, and you have by law requirements to provide truthful information to consumers. So it makes it more difficult to be able to quickly substitute from one ingredient to another. Plus, on some of these, there just isn't the global diversity. So I completely endorse Damien's point around we do need to make sure we've got diversity of markets that we trade with. And I think our government can really be helping us to find other sources of supply. And some of that we did see happen around the AdBlue, which is a diesel additive, and the work that they did to make sure that we shored up supplies there. But I think that there is more that we can do around getting some of those really core critical elements, not just in ingredients, but packaging, for example. We had some examples through this crisis where some businesses had a jar, but they didn't have the lids because the lids were imported. And you can't sell a packaged good if you can't put it into a package. You can't take your frozen peas home in your hands, you know. So I think it's really critical that we do look more at these really consolidated points and see how do we manage better for the future to minimize the risk where there is that consolidation in the supply chain.
Thanks, Tanya. Jars without lids. I feel like you've been looking in my kitchen cupboard. But I'd like to also get Matt's perspective on this, particularly at the firm level. You know, how are businesses thinking about their risks around diversity of suppliers and responding to that?
Thanks, Jared. Well, I absolutely agree with Damien and Tanya in terms of the firm level. Again, linked to the just-in-time kind of philosophies where there may be a rationalisation of supply. Clearly, the time has come to diversify supply base globally and through the global supply chain, but again, also regionally too, and really looking back into the local regional aspects of production and productivity, which again, I think it was a comment from Tanya, but actually and Damien, the productivity agenda really is so important here to really make it stable and resilient supply base. And so that's, to me, that would be the biggest decision at the firm level. And of course, linked to that is, in my mind at least, is the idea of resilience of those attendant supply chains, which is difficult without integration. And so by integration, I'm referring to collaborative data and forecasting, visibility, traceability along these supply chains. Something that we saw from or have seen from these disruptions is that it's extremely difficult to forecast because there have been unprecedented spikes in demands from left field, if you like, for many products and goods and services. And so we need to focus as well on how we maintain or indeed integrate that thinking into our planning and operations.
Thank you, Matt. I am going to turn to the audience questions at this point. And one for you, I think, at least to begin with, Damien, from David, and seems to have quite a few votes. What's our interpretation of the risks associated with the accumulation of the world's ships offshore in Shanghai, i.e. in one location? Obviously, we've seen a lot of kind of dramatic graphics of this at the moment, and just the kind of congestion we're seeing. How do you see this in that kind of global landscape that you've laid out?
Yeah, it's a huge problem. I definitely couldn't put a number on it, but it's massive and it's really difficult to solve. And maybe the best way of thinking about it is, what can governments do about this situation? I think we can throw our hands up and say this is a really difficult problem, but what can practically be done to ease some of these supply chain congestions, whether that's in China or elsewhere? I think infrastructure investment is long-term going to be really important for reducing queues outside ports and enabling them to accelerate container throughput, but that will take time. We're also going to need to see much greater upgrades to road, rail, warehousing facilities all around the world, probably especially in the United States. There's a trade facilitation agenda here, which can ease some of these supply chain bottlenecks. This has largely been done already in advanced economies, but only 60% of the developing world, for instance, has implemented the trade facilitation agreement, which reduces customs bottlenecks. There's a digitization aspect to this as well. Trade transactions are still largely paper-based, and this adds a lot of complexity behind the scenes and slows things down. But there are actually quite easy ways to move trade from analog to digital, including through countries adopting what's called the model laws on electronic transferable records. And then there's a trade finance aspect to this too, because there's still a huge trade finance gap of around $1.8 billion. And a lot of firms still can't even access trade. So there's lots of different things that governments can do, but they all really sit in, the individual country level policy domain. And it really requires a hell of a lot of coordination from governments as well.
Thanks, Damien. I think you've preempted the next question that's on Pigeonhole, so we might stick with this and get Tanya and Matt's perspectives as well, because Paul has asked, how can pressures on supply chains be relieved? How likely is this relief scenario in the next year or two? And I think there's some interesting issues to kind of pull out here. I think including the fact that really, despite the fact that we have seen some kind of level of moderation around goods demand and that goods services balance, we're still sitting at a level that's different to pre-pandemic in terms of elevated goods demand. And let's see what happens in terms of where demand heads in the next little while with increasing interest rates. And we've seen these kind of, certainly I've seen these charts, surveys of US business around when they see these supply chain issues beginning to moderate. And I just watch the bars going further and further right in terms of the timeline in which they expect that different issues are going to be relieved. And I think there was a lot of hope of 2022 being that point, and that's kind of shifting out to 2023. So Tanya, obviously we were talking before we came on about some of the experiences that we've had, and actually, we've learnt some things in terms of some of the disruption that we've had. So how do you see this in terms of how we sort of strengthen the system to bring relief and kind of the time that's going to take?
Look, I think it's really important to think about this from a short-term and a long-term perspective. But before I do, I just wanted to give an analogy so that people can understand why it is so difficult and takes so long to relieve these congestion points in the supply chain. If you think about an accident on the Sydney Harbour Bridge and the amount of congestion that builds up behind that, if you have that road accident cleared, it will still take a long time before that build-up of traffic can actually flow back to normal. So if you multiply that by what we're seeing at the moment, you can understand then why it takes such a long time. And I gave the example before about Western Australia. When we had the big floods earlier in the year in Central Australia, and we were trying to get product from the East Coast across to the West, we were coming together as industry, governments, retailers, and looking at what role we can all play to help with this. So the rail lines went down, the roads were cut. Government then made some short-term changes to allow flexibility for businesses to be able to move goods via coastal shipping. They also made some regulatory changes around road use and allowed B-doubles to be able to travel on back roads that normally weren't rated to be able to carry those trucks. So, I think there is that flex and ability for governments to be able to come together and work with industry to solve these things on a short-term level. And then there was also prioritisation within the sector, that recognition that there were some really critical issues that needed to be solved. So there were some issues around water treatment in South Australia and chemicals that needed to flow in there for that. Food and groceries getting to Western Australia. And even though government didn't get to the point of saying, okay, we're going to regulate that business must provide these things first, I think by governments assisting with the flow of information and facilitating groups coming together, industry then self-solved some of those by going, okay, let's really prioritise getting the food on the trucks first, so that when those rail and road lines opened up, that's what was prioritised. I come back to, though, the cost around the challenge around the costs of all of that, though. So, a lot of food and groceries are lower margin, higher volume products. And so when you start putting all these additional costs on shipping a lower value good around the country, that becomes really challenging. So in terms of the short term, I think that ability for industry to come together and solve some of these, was really helpful. There was also examples where governments made changes through the pandemic, such as changing the restrictions on when transport can then deliver into retail stores, so that the supermarkets could replenish their stores by being able to bring trucks in, later in the evenings or earlier in the mornings than they normally would be allowed to do. In terms of the longer term, though, we really do need to stop and think about what we can do there. So, the supply chains that have operated just in time do need a lot more resilience and flexibility built into them. One of the elements of that is having better data information flows right throughout the supply chain. And that gives businesses more transparency around what's happening, more understanding, better ability to be able to forecast and predict, and then to be able to solve for where they know ahead of time that there's going to be some challenges. And on top of that information flow is also using technology better to be able to automate some of the production processes. So we've got more efficiency, more competitiveness in local manufacturing as well. I think that whole move towards local manufacturing has really gotten on people's radars now. We have a lot of multinational businesses in the food supply chain in Australia. They do import products, but they also manufacture locally. They are now looking at how do they actually produce more locally and reduce some of their imports because of this disruption. And it does change the balance, the economics around local production versus global production. I think there's a watch out in that, though. There is a reason that Australia has lost some local manufacturing, and because it's of that kind of loss of core competitiveness. And that's where there is that important need to invest in capital technology that does mean that when we come out the other side of this, we are more competitive and efficient so that we're not building in higher cost local production. And the other thing that's happening is businesses are just holding more stock, whether it's ingredients, inputs, and finished goods. They are just holding more stock, which does mean more need for pallets, more need for warehousing to be able to make sure that then there's the ability to have that additional safety stock, additional flex for future challenges.
Thanks, Tanya. Matt, I'll come to you. I mean, I think Tanya's made a really good distinction between the things that governments can do at the high level, but also the things that business can do here. And interesting to note, you know, Damien talked about the shortage of chips and some of the adaptation, for example, that GM and Tesla have made in terms of just simplifying some of their procurement of semiconductors to be able to produce their goods faster in the current environment. How do you see this in terms of some of the things that business should be focusing on, and then the things that government should be focused on?
Okay, thanks, Jared. I think there's a clear need for simplification of supply chains as a call to that. So as you mentioned, the examples of Tesla and so forth, really being agile in their approach to some of these issues. I'd like to pick up on I guess the talk or discussion around digitization, or sort of supply chain 4, if you like, or industry 4. I think what this means for businesses is that we really need to position ourselves to be capable of adapting and adopting industry 4, new technologies and industry 4 type practices. And so, because there's a clear need and there are clear benefits with digitization, we've said transparency, traceability, and what have you, but that brings with it a need for another set of different skills within organizations. We need resources and employees with agile thinking, comfortable navigating through large volumes of data and communicating and assimilating that data across the supply chain. And I also think that we tend to, from what I can see, we tend to think about, at least in the research, industry 4 technologies and how they help. But to me, I also think we need to invest time in managing 4.0 and our approach to how we bring this on board and the extra requirements and needs for organizations. And I guess on the other side of the coin, perhaps we're talking a lot about supply chains and what they need to do. I wonder if perhaps change needs to happen on the demand side too. I mean, consumers are now more than ever aware of the environmental impacts of various products, goods, and services, waste in supply chains, and the scarcity of resources. So I wonder if there's something that governments can do to influence, or should maybe focus on influencing the changing the demand side of that equation.
Thanks, Matt. We've got a few questions still coming in, and I guess there's there's a couple here that are related to what we see in the future. And it strikes me that some of the issues around climate change, or some of the kind of, Ukraine war and so forth, you're seeing some big global shifts that are actually not unlike, in some respects, what we've seen during the pandemic in terms of kind of a simultaneous demand and supply kind of shock to what we would normally see. And perhaps I could start with you, Damien. The question's been asked: is the response to the invasion of Ukraine the beginning of a decoupling of global economies along geopolitical lines? So obviously, we've seen how disruptive that has been to the common kind of what we've become used to in terms of the flow of goods across borders. Is this something that you're thinking about a lot in terms of, future decoupling?
Yeah, it's a big question. I think it could very well be. We've obviously, looking at the broad global picture, you've obviously got the sanctioning countries mostly or exclusively in the advanced economies. Most emerging markets, non-Western countries, did not follow with sanctions, though they did follow with some of the sort of diplomatic and political statements against the war in Ukraine. And I think, there would be many countries out there thinking about how to build resilience into their own economic systems in case they end up being sanctioned one day themselves. And so China, India, other countries would be looking at Russia's experience and wondering how they can build resilience into their own systems. And so we may well be seeing an acceleration of fragmentation in payments systems. So there's a Russian alternative to SWIFT, for instance. We may see sort of currency, some pretty serious currency changes. Russia is not going to be integrated into the global economy for a really long time. And I think there is, starting to be more of a chance that a sort of economic bloc along sort of democratic lines and an economic bloc along sort of non-democratic lines may well start to emerge, but that will take a really long time, and it's not something that can be easily built. It takes a long time to negotiate trade agreements, for instance. The TPP, RCEP took years and years and years and years. And I think it's very, very early days still. This is the start of potentially a really long war. Russia is certainly in the outhouse, but I think many countries would also be extremely hesitant about overtly joining forces with Russia in any new sort of economic blocks. So I think those risks are there, but it's more about countries preparing themselves for the possibility of exogenous shocks rather than joining forces with Russia and other authoritarian regimes that, like China, for instance.
Thanks, Damien. And perhaps if I could put this question to you as well, Tanya. You've outlined some really significant changes that are here right now for leaders in your sector. How much have they had an opportunity to lift their gaze and look at some of these kind of future risks, or is it very much around addressing what's right in front of them now?
No, look, they're doing both at once. And interestingly, we've just had a big conference of food and grocery manufacturers, and these issues were front and center. So while, and this is what's so challenging, and it is a fast moving consumer goods industry, so you can't get behind on these things. So while the industry is still trying to manage all of this supply chain disruption in the short term, and when I say short, I think in really the next 18 months. So it's still going to linger for a while. We're also then looking at all those larger forces around particularly climate change and the impact that that's having. Businesses have made a lot of commitments in that space to reduce their emissions by, to net zero by 2050. And a lot of the big multinational companies particularly have got, very significant targets for 2030, 2040 as well. So there's a big focus on how do we actually do that. We're looking at collaborating with retailers across the whole supply chain so that we can manage not only scope 1 and 2 emissions within your own control, but how do you do that along the supply chain from, really from farm to fork. So that work's going on. There's also been a lot of developments around human rights in supply chains, for example. So looking back a number of years ago, understandably, there was a lot of criticism because there was a lack of transparency around supply chains. And there would be many layers. And when I mean that, it's that a retailer will buy a product from a supplier will then have multiple sources of ingredients. And for those ingredients, for example, if I want chopped chips into my biscuits, I might have 10 different suppliers into the chopped chip, let alone all the other suppliers of ingredients in. So there becomes a lot of darkness then. When I say darkness, that's probably the wrong word to use, but a lack of transparency around exactly where some of your ingredients are coming from, and therefore the practices and the labour treatment within those. So there's been a huge amount of work industry's done in that space. And there's also been some government regulation to improve transparency and improve human rights in supply chains. So yes, trying to be the, evolving for the long term while managing the significant disruptions in the shorter term.
Thanks for that, Tanya. And maybe this question to you as well, Matt, around given the uncertainty, and you've talked about the, VUCA, not quite like the YMCA, but the VUCA and that kind of impact on businesses looking out. I mean, what are the things, the kind of no regrets steps, I guess, that business can take in terms of dealing with what may be, a completely unexpected shock in the future on a geopolitical or other basis that can't be predicted?
Interesting question. Thanks, Sharon. I think it's to me, to respond to some of these unpredictable risks, I think it's essentially, I guess, working together with their immediate supply chain partners to increase transparency. As Tanya mentioned, there's been a lot of work in increasing transparency across supply chains, and essentially collaborating in terms of risk planning and simplifying their supply chains, and looking at how they can simplify yet diversify to, I guess, mitigate the impact of any risk. Now, I think it's a dual kind of approach. So clearly, we need to maintain global links, and globalization is a positive part of this. But also at the same time, again, come back to the regions and think about what's also locally available and who they can collaborate with to think about, I guess, innovative solutions or innovative collaborations to overcome many of these problems. I guess underpinning all this, of course, would be things like the Sustainable Development Goals, which I guess is a theme that we begin to unpack with comments from Damien and Tanya just now, and really thinking about how we would integrate those, or using those to inform some of our decisions and actions moving forward.
Thanks for that, Matt. I might just come to one last question that we've got in Pigeonhole, and might come to you first on this, Damien, just around a question around, are labour disputes likely to be a significant ongoing element of supply chain disruptions? We've obviously seen a little bit of this, but perhaps some of the conditions that we're seeing globally, including around inflation and, could lead to further kind of disputes around working conditions and so forth. Is this something that you're seeing as a potential point of tension?
That's not something that I've seen a lot of yet, but I guess it could be. Perhaps related to that labour question as well, though, which I think is starting to have an impact on supply chains, is this sort of wave of regulation coming out of the EU on human rights and labour standards. So I was mentioning companies having to really look very deep into their supply chains about, forced labour, for instance. And this is creating costs and slowing down transactions. So in that sense, labour issues are definitely having an impact already. And as the US also puts in place similar legislation, I think we'll see slowdowns over there as well. But insofar as we're talking about labour business interactions, I haven't yet been aware of that.
All right, thank you, Damien. I think we're just on time, so I might bring things to a close. I do want to thank all of you for your participation and breaking down some pretty complex things. And I think, Tanya, your analogy around car congestion and just how that takes time to resolve itself, and especially when you look across the global supply chain system, just how complex and how many different factors are at play, is a really important analogy and helps us to understand this better. But also, I think in all the comments that you've made, there are some things that we can do in the short term to bring relief, but we've also got to be really focused on the long term and how we build resilience around supply chains, and both the role that government and businesses themselves play in this. And of course, as an economist, I was very happy to hear everyone talk about the role of productivity, which obviously has much broader benefits in terms of our future living standards as well. So thank you very much, Matt Pepper, Tanya Barden, and Damien Bruckett. That's been fantastic. I do want to remind people to jump into Pigeonhole and rate your experience. We do use that feedback in terms of future live streams. Also, please keep an eye out for a post-event email that you'll get, which does include a link to today's live stream recording. So if you want to show it to other people or have another look, you will be able to do that. And today is just the first of a series of live streams and events that we'll have on supply chains. You've heard today just how complex some of these issues are, the evolving nature of them. And so we really want to keep digging into this and really going further. So we will do that. Also encourage you to stay in touch via CEDA.com.au. Keep an eye out on what we're doing. Follow us on LinkedIn, Twitter, wherever you like to get your social media fix. And we look forward to welcoming you again. In the meantime, hope the rest of your Friday is productive, and have a very good weekend. Thank you very much.